We've been working on defining metadata for a photosynthetically active radiation data product. And that we've been focusing first on the data table. And we've started with metadata that describes the table file, but we've also defined the metadata that describes the contents of that file. In particular, for tables, we really want to know what's in each column of the table. So we have 3 columns in our data table, and these are the 3 records of metadata that is telling us something about each of those columns. Now we're defining that metadata once, but it's going to several places. First of all, we're saving this metadata environment that we created to a file in the incremental folder for use later on in the workflow, because we might want to get at that metadata later on. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But it's also going to other places. For example, we are creating a text file with a CSV format where the metadata describing each column in the table is in its own CSV file in our data product that's accompanying the table. And that's primarily for convenience of people who want that metadata in a machine-readable format. This table is much easier to read into something like a data frame in R than it would be if we were to put it in a report that's more human-readable. But we also want it in human-readable reports, and we've put it into the incremental folder, into this processing notes HTML file, and it looks like this. So right alongside where we're defining all this metadata, we're putting it into the report, indicating the source of where this metadata is first originating. Now what we want to do is propagate that metadata through our workflow, because ultimately this metadata also needs to show up in the human-readable metadata that is accompanying our data product. Now it's in the data product now in terms of being in the incremental folder, but this is really the kind of thing that you also want to have in your README file, that the user who is not going to be digging into the guts of the incremental folder is probably not going to be looking at this. So how do we do that? Let's go back to our code. We've got our processing script that's generating the metadata. And we also, in our protocol folder, have our metadata, our markdown file that we got started a while ago. And we have an outline here with our title and our data entities and a data table for our particular deployment. So here's where we ultimately want to start recording the metadata in our README file. We need to read that data. So somewhere at the top of this, we need to pull that data in. So we can use the read RDS function. Oops. And we want to read in the file incremental. Oops, need to check my working directory here. Yep, I need to use my current working directory for knitter. There we go. I need to go to incremental, and here is that metadata.r data file that we're using save RDS from our processing script, and we need to read that back into our metadata script so we can use this metadata in generating the README file. Then under data table, we'll have access to that metadata, and the data table itself, we can say, well, what's the path in the pipeline? Again, I like to put paths in italics, so I'm going to put this asterisks around this. And then I just need to pull the information about the path from this metadata environment. And that's going to be in the variable table, which is a list, and the element named path from that list. And then the format for this file is also in that metadata. And finally, I can put the description here. So this way, I don't have to worry about keeping multiple copies of the same information. up to date. If I need to change it, I'll change it in one place in processing. And when I rerun all of these reports, it will automatically propagate through these reports, any changes that I make. So that is the metadata. We also have metadata for another kind of file here. So after the data table, we need a section for the table metadata. So I'm going to copy this heading material as a basis. And I think I only really need to comment what these mean once. So I'm going to get rid of that comment. And here, this is going to be the next third level heading underneath this second level heading. So I want to increment my third level heading number. And then I'm going to call this table metadata. So this is the file. I'm going to give the metadata for the file that is describing the columns of the data table. So again, I've got a path for this. But this time it's the ATTR or attribute file, or I'm sorry, attribute list with metadata in it. But it's going to have a path. Actually, I'm just going to do some copying and pasting here, because this is all going to be basically the same thing, but with ATTR in the place of table. And finally, similar to how I did it in the processing notes, I can use the cable function from knitr to actually include the metadata for the columns in a human readable form in the report. So if I open up my rendering script for the metadata file and I run this, we'll see if I've created any bugs. Okay, that seemed to run. I can go to the product folder and look at the README. And now I can see that I have the path to the data table, the format of the data table, a UTF-8 text file in comma delimited tabular format. And this is telling me more generally, this is photosynthetically active radiation data collected at a particular location. I then have the table of metadata for this data table. And that's going to be in table meta.csv for the same deployment ID. Again, this is a text file in comma delimited format. This is a table of metadata describing the column attributes in the data table for that deployment. And finally, I have the actual metadata. That is the same metadata that you will find in the product in this file, text file, CSV file right here. We've described two of the files in our data product, but there's a couple of more that we might want to go ahead and take care of. If I go back to the R code and go back to processing, remember our processing file, our markdown is creating a data visualization. So perhaps we also want to define a description of this data visualization file for our data product, in which case I need to add another variable to our metadata environment. I'm going to call this VIS for visualization. And like the other elements or the other variables, I'm going to use a list to keep track of 3 different characteristics of this file that I want to report. Again, that's a path, that is a format, and a description. I don't want to force you to watch me type, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste from my notes here. Again, I'm going to use that DEP name variable that is holding my deployment name that I want to keep common across all of these different elements. And I'm constructing, using paste, a path to a file based on this name. And in this case, I'm making it an underscore viz for visualization after the deployment name. And what I'm using here is a PDF file. So I'm generating a PDF using my graphics engine. And that means the format for this particular file is what's called a portable document format file. That's what PDF stands for, is portable document file. It's a kind of a hybridized text and binary file format that was put together by Adobe based on the PostScript language. And finally, we need a description. Again, this is going to break across multiple lines of code because it's a little long. So I'm going to use paste 0 to put together my description. That's going to be summary visualization of photosynthetically active radiation data from deployment. And again, I'm going to use that dep name variable to just pop the name of the deployment into this description. Again, that way, if I ever need to change this, decide for a different deployment name that I want to use, I just have to change it one place and it will automatically change everywhere where I use it. Okay, so now this metadata is being written to this viz. If I want to use that in my metadata, then I already have the code that writes this to a file. So all I need to do is go back to my protocol, bring up my processing rendering script, and run this to rerun the processing code. That should resave the metadata in the incremental, which means the next time I run this metadata RMD that's generating my README, it will have access to that. And I can add another section to my README. I don't have to change this code this time because I'm just, again, incrementing the third level heading counter by 1 for this new. I just need to change the name of the heading, and I'm going to call this the summary visualization. Oops. And I really need similar code here as I've used before, so I can just copy and paste this. But instead of attr, it's going to be viz. Let me just double check that I've used viz. Yeah, viz. Now finally, there is one more file that's going to be in my product. And this is a little bit self-referential, but if I look at the product, recall that this markdown that I'm working on is getting compiled into a README file. And I want to make sure people know what that README file is. Even though they kind of have to know what it is, they'd be able to open this README file to see this description. Still, just to be complete, I want to make sure that README file is defined. So I need something like this. Again, I like to put a little more blank space between sections so it's a little clearer where new sections are starting. Let me just do that, okay? Again, I don't have to change this code because I'm just incrementing it by one more, but I do have to change the name of the heading, and I'm going to change this to README file. And here, the metadata is not going to be predefined, so I'm going to have to put this in. So this is going to be in the for product underscore product. Now, sometimes an underscore character in Markdown will cause issues because the underscore can be a Markdown character in some situations, a special character indicating formatting. So if you want to be sure that that Markdown is not interpreted underscore as some sort of programming character, you can put a backslash, what's called an escape character before it, to say, I want you to read this as a literal underscore character and don't try to interpret it as code. So I like to do that for underscores just to make sure that my markdown doesn't end up looking weird because it tries to interpret that as some sort of encoding of formatting. So this, when it goes into the report, is just going to be for underscore product readme.html. Again, I don't want to bore you with a bunch of typing, so I will just copy and paste. This is a UTF-8 text file, so it's still a text file, but it's not a CSV text file. It is a hypertext markup language text file. So this is UTF-8 text file with encapsulated hypertext markup language content. So it's a text file with a particular kind of content that a web browser knows how to turn into nice formatting for text. So that's what our data file type is. And finally, what this file does is provide a detailed description of the data product. So now we have a description in our README of the current contents of our data product. I'll go ahead and run this to render it, and then go back to our browser, hit refresh. And now we have 2.1.1 data table, 2.1.2 table metadata, 2.1.3 summary visualization, and the path, the format, and the description of that file. And then the README file with, again, the path, the format, and the description of the README file. Again, that's to describe the current contents of our data product, these 4 files.